tomorrow should be really feel honored then. I'm also no professor or professor emeritus. I am just a school teacher. I'm teaching languages and social sciences at secondary school level in Norway. So my presentation will be the historic view on climate change, and it comes more from my keen interest in history than my teaching, really. So it's just a strong interest of mine. So do climate conditions affect the rise and fall of civilizations? Yes, that finally seems, that's always been the case, but it finally seems also to be recognized by most historians. So what climate conditions then affect the civilizations? It turns out that civilizations have flourished during the warm periods and experienced decline or succumbed during the cold periods. Why is that? Probably partly because a warm climate is more stable, has more stable weather and more precipitation, especially in the tropics and in the subtropical areas. Whereas the periods of cold climate have much more unstable weather and less precipitation in the tropics and the subtropical areas. There might actually be a bit more rain in the northern areas, but we'll get back to that. You probably know this graph. Is that well known to you? There's the same one actually over at the roll-up poster here. It's a graph from which has on the left-hand side the temperature from ice cores on Greenland, and to the right side estimated global temperatures based on proxy data. So we can see from this graph that the two warmest periods were about 8,000 years BC, and then again a very warm period about 3,000 years BC. And but in between there was a very cold and dry period. I don't know if I should have had a pointer here, but I haven't. So the two warm periods are often referred to, or the first warm period is often referred to as the Holocene optimum, and the next one is the Bronze Age, a shorter warm period. And there's an interesting period, there was an interesting period in between these two, a long and cool and very dry period. That period from 4000 BC to 2000 BC seriously affected the subtropics and the tropic regions on the globe, and it's characterized by the researchers as a mega drought that lasted for more than 2,000 years. Ice cores from around the world, both from Africa, from the Himalayas, and sediments from Egypt show that this was a global thing, that drought was global. The cooling during this period, it also became considerably colder in large areas, including the eastern Mediterranean, which we will have a closer look at. And research also shows that it was colder in the North Atlantic, more ice in the North Atlantic during the same period. This had an interesting effect, this dry period. For instance, you've probably heard many times that the Sahara dried up during this period. It used to be, it had been a savanna, there had been river systems and lakes, and as northern Africa dried up, people migrated, and they migrated, a lot of them, towards the east, towards the the Nile, where there was still water. And thus, the civilization in Egypt started when people in large numbers came there. So the Old Kingdom started from 3500 BC. But we have to look at what is a civilization? What's the definition? Historians say that there has to be three things present. An urban development with a division of labor and social classes. There has to be some kind of monumental architecture, and there has to be a written language. If these three are there, we have what we call a civilization. So where did the first civilizations appear? The first one started about 4000 BC in Sumer and Mesopotamia, which you see here in the middle. And the next one out was the Old Egypt, 3500 BC. Then came the Indus Valley in now Pakistan, also about 3000 BC, and finally China from 1600 BC. And the three first ones actually happened more or less on the same basis as the Egyptian one, because the historians think that when it started to get drier, people were concentrated in some areas. For instance, around the rivers in Mesopotamia, in India, and later on in China. Did you have a question?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
The Aboriginals in Australia, they are not a civilization then?
I guess not. I'm not very familiar. Did they have
don't have any of those?
No. So they would not be characterized by historians
What
as
do you call them?
a culture, perhaps.
Culture?
Mm.
They might be.
So several of these civilizations were founded on the need to find water, and people concentrated around the rivers. Then let's go to the Bronze Age, because that's when civilizations really develop. 2500 BC until 1200 BC. But historians say that actually the Bronze Age in the Nordic countries lasted until 500 BC. That's a normal definition. So the cool and dry period, more than 2,000 years long, finally ended and was followed by a marked rise in temperature. And how were conditions then during the Bronze Age? Well, it was up to 3 degrees higher than today in the northern hemisphere, and up to 2 degrees higher globally. You might see that I quote Ljungqvist a lot, a Swedish historian who's written a very good book, big book, about the climate history, Klimatet och människan under 12,000 år. So I can recommend that one. Although his last chapter says that now there's no natural climate change anymore, now it's simply only caused by CO2, and forget all the rest, forget history, sort of cancels out his own book. But he has gone really deep into the issue, so a very interesting book. In Asia and in the Middle East, there was abundant precipitation, and during this period, an emergence of large agricultural communities. In China, the first Chinese civilization emerges and expands from approximately 1600 BC. In Northern Europe, there was a warm climate with mild winters, and that provided good conditions for the development of agriculture. And in Denmark, for instance, they even cultivated millet, which requires 2 degrees higher average summer temperatures than we have today. Hirse på millet is hirse in Norwegian. I don't know what it is in Swedish and Danish. There we go. And we know that, for instance, in Norway, the tree limit was approximately 300 meters higher than today, above sea level, and that the high mountain ranges like Hardanger and Dovre plateaus were wooded for most of this period. And the glaciers, these sorts of falls beneath the picture here, I guess there's nothing we can do with it, but it says that the glaciers, there were no glaciers in Norway. They had all melted away, and hardly any in the Alps, and none in the Alps, and hardly any in Iceland and in Svalbard, Spitsbergen. I think there must be something on my PC here that, if I could get rid of that bar at the bottom. Let's see. I thought I had. No, strangely it's still here when I choose. Okay, guess we'll just have to.
It works anyway.
Yeah, it works
Yeah.
anyway. Yep.
Yeah.
So there's another thing about the Bronze Age which has been sort of focused on over the last decade. At least I've read articles in newspapers and so on where they say the historians say that they are quite surprised with how integrated and international the European cultures were at this time. There was an extensive north-south trade with weapons, jewelry, glass, etc. And there was an exchange of technology, for instance, boat building. There were also long-distance travels. I've read articles about finding of an old body in a bog in Denmark, a sort of a princess or a high-rank female, and they can see that she was born in the Mediterranean, but she actually lived her grown-up life in Denmark. So things like that. I'm going to say a little bit about the Eastern Mediterranean, the Bronze Age there, because there was an extensive trade between the different cultures and civilizations around the Eastern Mediterranean. The Minoans in Crete, and the Hittites in Turkey, the Mycenae culture in the old Greece, where it is now Greece, Mesopotamia, which later became Syria, and in Cyprus and Egypt. They were all trading. They had an extensive trade and communication with each other. They had to trade with tin and copper, because you need tin and copper to make bronze, and they were found in completely different places. But also they traded timbers, which Egypt didn't have, for instance, but the Hittites had a lot of it, and also grain. Egypt had a lot of grain. The others needed to import grain. But then something happened. In the year 1177 BC, the Bronze Age civilizations around the Eastern Mediterranean more or less collapsed. And there's a very interesting book written about it by an American historian called Klein, and it's called The Year Civilization Collapsed. I saw a television program about him. He had sent the book to the printers and had written all about this collapse, but they had no idea, the historians, why. Then he came across newly published scientific works saying that there was a climatic change happening just at in the same year, or very, very at absolutely the same time. And then he called the printer and said, "Stop the print! I have to completely revise the book. There was a climatic cause to this collapse." And he rewrote it, and it was published again, as you see it here. What had been, the researchers had found out that through analysis of pollen, sediments, ice cores, and etc., that there was a sudden, quite dramatic global cooling. There was more ice in the North Atlantic. The sea temperature sank with 2 degrees, 2 to 3 degrees, suddenly in the East Mediterranean. Very dramatic drop. And a 200-year-long severe drought set in the subtropical areas. The monsoon was failing in Asia and Eastern Africa at the same time. And the results were, of course, crop failure, hunger, collapse in trade, revolts and migrations. The written sources in Egypt tell about this year. The sources date it and say that the sea people came. They came and tried to invade Egypt. Egypt had a strong army, so they didn't manage to take Egypt, but they caused complete havoc in all the other areas. So the only really surviving civilization in the Mediterranean was Egypt, but in decline, because the water in the Nile was also reduced. And then what happened in Egypt was that the old kingdom collapsed and was eventually replaced by the new kingdom. There was also a decline in Mesopotamia. The Assyrian civilization now took over, and the Indus Valley civilization completely disappeared. So if you wanted to read more about this climatic episode and what it caused, I can recommend this book by Klein.
I think you can say some words of what caused this climate, this sudden collapse.
This sudden climate change.
Yes.
Well, it was crop failure and hunger that caused the collapse, because people started migrating. They were starving, and they.
But that started.
But
What started that it cooled
okay,
down?
yeah.
Yes.
I don't know if it was a solar minimum or anything else. I'm not certain. There was no reasons given in the book for that, but maybe someone else knows.
I think I read a book saying that you had simultaneous volcano eruptions on the eastern part of the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of ash stuff in the atmosphere that stopped the sun to shine.
Klein tells about several volcanic eruptions and earthquakes in the decades leading up to this collapse. But something else happened, he says. It was much more dramatic. There was a sudden deterioration that must have had another cause. But that's often the case. We'll see later that there's a period of falling temperatures, and then suddenly there's a dramatic change. I don't know, somebody remembers the Trojan War? Was a bit later, wasn't it?
No.
Yeah, no?
Yeah. The fall of Troy was exactly.
Oh, there you go. So, yeah, exactly. It happened all around the Mediterranean, that there were wars and migrations and attacks and warships coming. So that sounds. But after a few hundred years, or some 100 years, the temperatures picked up again. Sorry, and there was more rainfall again in the Mediterranean and in the Middle East and also in the Far East. Also in Central America, conditions improved, and the Mayan culture started to emerge from the 300s BC. What happened in Europe then? In ancient Greece, the great area of Greek antiquity started during this period. The temperatures had really picked up by about 500 BC. So from 480 to 30 BC, we had the great Greek antiquity. The democracy in Athens developed from the early 400s, and the construction of the Parthenon began also during the same period. The Roman Republic also started developing in this period, started around 500 BC and started expanding beyond today's Italy from about 400 BC. But there's a couple of small climate events from this period that are interesting. Did climate events cause the fall of the Roman Republic? Some historians think they did. There were several volcanic eruptions in the 40s BC. They know for certain about one in Alaska, the Okmok volcano, but also others. And some years of cold and wet climate followed. It led to unrest and attacks against the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire had a great army commander, Caesar. So he managed to hold the attacks away and prevented this disintegration of the Roman Empire. He then returned to Rome as a hero, and he seized power, and the Republic, he became an emperor, and the Republic fell in 44 BC. So that might have had climatic causes. Also, Egypt's independence ended after this event. There were several years of drought in East Africa and a reduced water level in the Nile. And there were results were crop failures and hunger. So Egypt's independence ended during this same period, the 40s BC, and you might know that Cleopatra killed herself in 31 BC. In China, also flourished during these warm centuries before BC, and the Greater Chinese Empire, we often say, was established from 221 BC. And the construction of the Great Wall started during the same period. So they had invasions from the north, but it was not stabilized, and they built the Great Wall to prevent any more of that. The two first centuries AD marked a very stable and good period for the Roman Empire. It's referred to as Pax Romana. I don't know if you say that, if English historians use the same term, but Pax Romana is at least something I remember from school and that you might know. It lasted from 27 BC to 180 AD. During the same period, Egypt also had a good period, now under Rome, with stable and ample Nile floods. But this good, warm, wet period couldn't last forever. So from the early 200s, it became increasingly colder, drier, and more unstable again. And then what is referred to by historians as the migration period started. People migrated from the north and from the east to find better conditions, and the Roman Empire eventually had to give in and disintegrated completely, and Rome fell, at least the Western Roman Empire, and Rome fell in 410 AD. So of course, when I learned about Folkevandringstida, as it was called, as it is called in Norwegian, the migration period, at school, no one talked about climatic causes for these migrations, but now historians have included that aspect and explain it in that way. But then something really, really dramatic happened in the around 550 AD. Then there was what we can call a complete climate catastrophe. It started in the year 536. The global temperatures had fallen already from the 300s, but the real dramatic fall happened from the 500s. There was crop failure over large parts of the world. Would it be possible to have a glass of water? And this was followed by 100 years of extreme weather and hunger. In the northern hemisphere, there was a sudden temperature drop of 2 to 3 degrees. Tusen takk. Suddenly there was a global drop of 2 to 3 degrees and up to 4 degrees in the Nordic countries. There was a period of several years that had no summers, the historians say. It was extremely cold and very snowy winters. In Northern Europe, the historians say that there was an archaeological completely quiet period with no archaeological finds, from this period of 200 years. And in Norway and Sweden, we know that there were many areas were completely depopulated. Not only higher lying areas, but actually rich agricultural areas. Well, by studies of Poland and so on, they can see that these areas that had been cultivated were taken over by forests at this time. Sorry. So they say that they can see that people and livestock must have left the farms. There are reports from this period from China of snowfalls reported in the middle of the summer. And in China, Peru, the Middle East and Persia, we know there were several years of severe drought. Here we know a little bit more about the causes of this dramatic climatic event. There was a deep solar minimum. I can't remember. I tried to find a name, if there was a name for this solar minimum. I haven't found it. We know that several volcanoes had major eruptions from 536 to 541, among other places in Iceland, in North America, in Kamchatka in Russia, and in Southeast Asia. There was Katla in Iceland had a massive eruption in 536, and they also think there was a very big one in Southeast Asia, probably in Indonesia, which can be categorized as a super eruption. It took 200 years before the temperatures had completely recovered. And then we enter the period of the warm Middle Ages. From the mid-1700s to the early 1200s, the climate was warm and quite stable. There were good times in Europe. Rich crops gave economical and cultural growth, and the population in Europe more than doubled. The warmest century was the 900s. The global temperature was then up to 2 degrees higher than today. And we know that the forest line in North Europe was 200 meters higher above sea level than today. And also in Great Britain, they were growing crops much higher than today. And there was widespread viticulture and wine production in England. In Germany, the viticulture was up to 800 meters, whereas today it is only possible up to 550 meters above sea level. In the North Atlantic and in the Arctic, the glaciers in Svalbard were significantly smaller than today, all completely gone. And in Iceland, the summer the limit of summer pack ice was only 200 kilometers north of the island. Today it's 400 kilometers north of the island. There was also a heyday of craftsmanship and architecture in Europe, with both in Eastern Europe, with churches built in different style, of course, with the Gothic churches in Western Europe, and the Byzantine architecture in the east. Also, the Vikings had a good time. There was a north expansion to Greenland. The temperature was probably 1.5 degrees warmer than today in southern Greenland at the time, and it's been established by Danish archaeologists that they actually cultivated barley at Greenland during this period. Also in the east, a warmer climate gave good times, a stable monsoon and good temperatures. So the monsoon in China strengthened and also reached further north. And that led to a more centralized power, technical development and cultural flourishment in China. Also in India there was a stable and abundant monsoon which gave rich crops, flourishing art and architecture. You've probably heard about Angkor Wat in today's today's Cambodia, where very abundant rains, very abundant monsoons enabled the construction of gigantic cities and religious centers. The biggest one, Angkor Wat, was covering 400 square kilometers. There was also a favorable climate in South America during this period. The Chimu culture was a highly structured society with a productive agriculture and really large cities. And they experienced a decline from the 1300s when violent fluctuations in the El Niño cycle happened. And then the Inca Empire gradually took over the Chimu areas. However, in Central and North America, it was the opposite. There was a very dry period. I won't go a lot into detail here, because I think we should try to get to the end soon. But of course, these good times couldn't last forever. A new bad period had to come, and it started already to get more unstable during the 1200s, but the really dramatic change happened from the early 1300s. Then the Little Ice Age started. The global temperatures dropped. They were approximately 2 degrees colder than they had been during the Middle Ages, and at least 1 degree lower than today on average. The whole period was not consistently cold over globally, but it was characterized by many sudden and erratic changes and in the climate. And research, Ljungqvist, the Swedish author, says that research from later years have shown that the Little Ice Age was indeed global, even if it wasn't as cold all the time throughout the whole period. So what did the misery of the climate worsening in the 1300s lead to? It was first very cold and very wet, then cold and unstable, and there were floods, droughts, failing crops and hunger, and probably 1.5 million people died from hunger during the first half of the 1300s. And of course, you know what it led to, the Black Death. Spread over Europe and killed maybe up to 80 million people. From the late 1300s to the 1600s, it continued to be cold and unstable. And what then happened? I think it's interesting to note that this was the period of the Inquisition. Perhaps it was no accident that this happened during this horrible climatic period. After a milder period during the first decade in the 1500s, the cold took hold again, and it continued for the rest of the century. And in the 1600s also it was very wet, cold and dry. although in northwestern Europe there was also very wet summers. The monsoons during these centuries often failed in Southeast Asia, and there were several cold and dry years in China and Japan that led to widespread hunger and rebellions. There were also severe droughts in the Middle East and the Eastern African regions. And then what happened in Europe during the 1600s mostly? Well, you had the witch hunts. Maybe that was no accident either, it was not by chance. Just to take an example from Norway, from 128 people in the north of the country were burnt at the stake as a public punishment, most of them women. But what were they accused of? What was the typical accusation? It was that they had produced bad weather, and they were burned after convictions for causing storms and deaths with their magical powers. So that was the explanation at that time, was the witches' fault. In South America, the Little Ice Age wasn't very pleasant either. They tried to resolve the harsh conditions with sacrificing children, to see if that helped. Finally, the Little Ice Age culminates. And from the early 1700s, the first decades, there was a really fast rise in temperatures. Globally, about a half degree, and significantly more in the Nordic regions, the northern regions. And from the 1700s and up to our time, we've had a gradual warming, although with several setbacks. And maybe it was again then not by accident that a new age of enlightenment started, an age of science, reason, freedom and tolerance, with industrialization and the end of feudalism and reforms and also revolutions. We can perhaps say that during the 1700s the foundations for our modern civilizations were laid. From the 1820s, the Little Ice Age finally ends. And I'm now coming to the end of the lecture. Is it important? Is it really that important to know history? Well, some famous men have said that yes. What history can teach us, the most important lesson is that we haven't learned enough from history. That's Aldous Huxley and Chesterton. We can be almost certain of being wrong about the future if we are wrong about the past. Can it be dangerous maybe not to know history? I would say yes. I'm a bit worried by researchers founded by, for instance, Bill Gates, who want to cool the Earth temperature by 2 degrees. The temperature has picked up approximately 1.2 degrees since the Little Ice Age. So what they basically want to do is to take us back to the worst and coldest period of the Little Ice Age, the 1600s. And what if, at the same time, while they are spraying all this stuff into the atmosphere, what if a big volcanic eruption happens? Then we can maybe be set back to conditions like in the 500s AD. So to know history is really important. Thank you. That was all I had to say.